This is Kosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to a Kosmographia podcast. We are here to discuss whatever Randall wants to talk about. That's right.
Yep.
That's right. And I think we're done with Atlantis. We're moving on to all things Younger-Dryas.
Actually, we'll never be done with Atlantis. Atlantis will be hovering over us no matter where we go. We can't talk about the Younger-Dryas without the implication of Atlantis, because the story of Atlantis, right, is set right into that milieu of transition between Pleistocene and Holocene, which is something we're going to really get into in depth, because it's such a critically important time in our planetary history and in the history of the human species. So it's a time that warrants much deeper scrutiny and consideration. So I see everybody's here, the usual suspects.
Right.
The Shiny Brothers, Brad, Normal Guy, we're all here, so I guess we're good to go.
We are good to go.
Okay.
Working on the shiny. We're trying to increase it. So, working on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are some salves or
Yes.
some unguents.
Well, and we will catch up, so we're not 4 episodes behind of people actually seeing what we're talking about. So yeah, in a month or two, we'll actually get caught up where the
That's
newest ones are actually being seen that in real time.
That's right. And that'll allow us to really delve more into current events. Right now, it's kind of pointless to do events because the posting of the videos and everything is about a month or so behind. But
right,
we're catching.
I'm on episode 6. You guys are doing episode 7. We're now recording episode 11. So yeah, maybe another month, and we'll synchronize everything.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Brad, could you maybe tell us a little bit about your backdrop there?
Well, I just took a trip with the big RC up to Minnesota. So this is Gooseberry Falls, and I selected this one out of probably a dozen good ones I've got, because there's all kinds of gorges and slot canyons and pothole integrated stream beds flowing into the north shore of Lake Superior. So I spent time while Randall was at a 3-day retreat exploring up from Duluth, Minnesota, up to Grand Portage, which is right next to the Canadian border there. The Pigeon River defines the border with Canada. And just an amazing drive, amazing group of state parks and hikes that you can make. And this one is the Middle Falls. Behind me is the Middle Falls of Gooseberry Falls State Park, which is the one closest in that stretch to Duluth, Minnesota. So yeah, it's totally worth making that drive if you're anywhere near that part of the country. And I want to add in there, because it seems that the water's brown. I noticed that right away. That's kind of root beer colored, and that's what one of the guys that run the gate at the entrance to the park said, well, there's a reason if I can spoil it for you. And I said, yeah, go ahead and tell me. He said, well, it's brown because the organic matter up in the swamps upstream on the highlands from here. So it's not necessarily from the rocks or from this or that. It's organic matter that makes the water brown like that. But all these different falls are root beer colored.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course the falls, the slot canyons, the potholes, the cliffs, all of this is a legacy of the big meltdown that occurred at the end of the last ice age. Completely created this landscape. So,
which we were looking at, on the trip with the drumlin fields there in Wisconsin, and there were others in Minnesota that I didn't get quite out to, but we recently published a video on the potential of Lake Nipigon being an impact site. So all these features are pretty much directly south and in line with an outflow that could have been subglacial flooding after an impact into that Lake Nipigon region. This everything around Lake Superior and the outlet of the south end of Lake Michigan near Chicago that flows into the Illinois River that we explored a little bit. I mean, yeah, it's just it seems to make a lot of sense if that was an impact site there at Nipigon, just north of all these places.
Yeah, and so we will be exploring that in much more detail so that folks listening to this can kind of get the picture and how it all fits together. But yeah, we on this trip, we did our second exploration of the Illinois River, which was a conduit for huge amounts of meltwater that were essentially issuing from the southern terminus of the Michigan lobe of the Laurentide ice sheet, which would be right pretty much in the area of Chicago. We then, last year, explored the Wisconsin River. Was it the year before? Maybe, but we've explored the Wisconsin River, which was a drainage of what is so-called Glacial Lake Wisconsin, which was just a massive puddle of meltwater. And we'll get into that. It created some extraordinary landforms, including the Wisconsin Dells, which actually is pretty much of a tourist area in Wisconsin. A lot of people might know about Wisconsin Dells, particularly if they're from the Midwest. So the Wisconsin River was a conduit for massive flows. And then, of course, the Mississippi, also a conduit for gigantic meltwater flows. To the west of there, the Minnesota River was also massive flows, and it served as the conduit for the southern drainage of Glacial Lake Agassiz. So all of these various elements we will be putting together in a coherent presentation so people can get the whole picture of what happened, or at least to the extent that we now understand it. But yeah, so here's the thing. Most of the river valleys in North America are legacies of these gigantic flows, even the ones that didn't head directly onto the ice sheet, because they were the recipient of massive precipitation events, pluvial events, if you want to use that term, pluvial, which means rainfall, even in the southeast. And again, we'll be looking at that too, so that we see some of the landscapes of the southeast, the southwest, the northeast, how the whole continent basically bears the imprints of these massive catastrophic episodes that not only terminated the last ice age, but even go back further than that to even earlier catastrophes. The problem is, when you're trying to understand the earlier catastrophes, is that when you have a succession of catastrophes or cataclysmic events, the younger ones tend to largely obscure the older ones. But once you've kind of teased out the nature of these landscapes, you can then begin to almost perceive in certain areas through the existing configuration to see that there's older landscapes that have maybe been oftentimes buried. Because, whenever there's erosion, you have material being transported. That means somewhere else you have deposition. It means that where one landscape is getting stripped away, somewhere else there's a corresponding landscape that's getting buried. And so between the stripping away and the burying, oftentimes whatever was there before, the previous world, the previous landscape, is not there anymore. So, and that's the thing that I am hoping that one of the insights that comes out of this series that we're going to do is that people really begin to understand how extreme the remodeling of this planetary surface was during the last glacial termination, and then with that insight in hand, being able to look back and realize, yeah, we've had multiple episodes of planetary remodeling, if you will, and each one tends to eliminate largely the landscapes that went before. So if you had any kind of culture, any kind of civilization, which gets us back to that question, that existed 20 or 30,000 years ago, it wouldn't be surprising that it's been largely erased. And so, this constant question of, well, where are the potsherds? Where are the toolkits? Where's the evidence that there were people, existing back then? Well, that's what many of those, skeptics, if you will, of an older culture have failed to understand is the extent to which the planetary surface has been completely rearranged. And once you understand that, then you begin to see, oh, yes, I can now see why we wouldn't expect to find a lot of evidence, because that world doesn't exist anymore, literally. So,
Right.
and I mean, we've been talking about Atlantis as kind of using that as a metaphor. And I want to make it clear here. I am not saying that we found Atlantis. This is Atlantis. And I'm not really saying that. What I'm saying is that this could be. It could be, because it's consistent. That's what I'm trying to show, is that it's consistent with really the only real account we have. So what I'm saying is not necessarily even that this was Atlantis. I think what I'm really trying to say is that there could have been a culture on a group of large islands in the mid-Atlantic during the last ice age. I don't know about the climate, the ocean, the nature of the changes, and so on, and what we've seen in terms of the vertical movements and so on. I mean, so what we're saying is that there could have been.
Yeah.
You can't just a priori rule out the possibility that there could have been a, sophisticated maritime culture, right? We're not, you notice we're not saying anything about flying machines or crystal technology or aliens or any of that. And I'm not saying that they may, that someone back whenever, and we're going to get into that in future episodes. Certainly the idea that there was much more sophisticated advanced knowledge in prehistoric times than the standard models have recognized. I mean, I think we all have looked into this thing enough to know that there's just the anomalies and the coincidences are too great. It gets to the point where you can kind of keep sweeping things under the rug for just so long until finally there's no more room under the rug anymore, and everything just starts spilling out. And that's kind of where we're at now. There's just, you walk in, there's a big lump in the middle of the room of the carpet, and under that is all of this stuff that doesn't make sense within the standard paradigm of prehistory. So in that context, it'd be good to start looking in more detail at that series of changes that marked the transition from the Pleistocene epoch into the Holocene epoch. And the Holocene epoch is the one we're in basically now. It means the whole of the modern, or the whole of the recent era. That's, Holocene, and scene means recent, just like when you look at all of these names that go back, you have the epochs, and the epochs are part of the periods, and the periods are part of a greater category. So when we get down to the detail of the Pleistocene Holocene transition, we have sub-stages that we name. We were talking about that earlier. We've got the older Dryas. That's followed by the Bering stage. That's followed by the Alarode or Alarod stage. That is then followed by the Younger Dryas, and the Younger Dryas is followed by the Pre-Boreal. So these are the terms that geologists and climatologists will contrive in order to be able to talk about it without always going, oh, well, that period of from 10,900 to 11,600 years ago, we give it a name, and everybody who's interested in this quickly learns the name and knows what they're talking about when you say the Pre-Boreal or the Younger Dryas. And it's interesting to me that 5, 6, 7 years ago, virtually nobody outside of the geological community or scientific community, which might have included geologists, paleontologists, maybe paleoclimatologists, nobody really knew what the term, or was not familiar with the term Younger Dryas. And I think it'd be safe to say that now probably millions of people have heard the term Younger Dryas. So that has been, because when I was early on studying this things, in the late 80s and early 90s, especially when it was just first being appreciated that the Younger Dryas really was an extreme transition. I mean, who knew about it back then? I mean, basically nobody. It was just, a small group. Probably not more than 100 people worldwide. If you said Younger Dryas, I mean, how many people understood that, Younger Dryas, that there was an older Dryas and the Younger Dryas? The word Dryas comes from Dryas octopetala, which was this polar wildflower that had been prevalent in Europe during the late glacial maximum, the coldest depth of the ice age. disappeared during the warming that was basically between about 15,000 and 13,000 years ago in rough numbers, disappeared, and then suddenly came back again after 13,000 years ago. So the older Dryas, was the last period of severe glacial cold, and then that was punctuated by these two warming episodes, back-to-back warming episodes. And then they gave way to the Younger Dryas when the polar wildflower came back again and showed up. And then, of course, disappeared again at the end of the Younger Dryas.
I think it's safe to say that the number of Ice Age nerds has grown exponentially in the last 5 years due to Randall Carlson influence.
That's definitely true.
Well, that and Graham Hancock, of course.
No doubt.
Because, he was really focusing in Fingerprints of the Gods, he was really focusing in on the Younger Dryas and invoking a catastrophe, back before just about anybody was. And what he didn't do in Fingerprints of the Gods, and he said this himself, is really specifically identified the nature of the catastrophe. And he was drawing upon the work of Charles Hapgood, who came up with this idea of a crustal slippage, that the lithosphere moving with respect to the mantle, which I think there's an element of truth to that. I don't think it's fast enough, though, in order to explain the catastrophic events that Hapgood was attempting to explain with that idea. And then, of course, between 1996, when Fingerprints of the Gods came out, and when he began writing Magicians of the Gods, that is when the evidence was found for the impact event at the Younger-Dryas Boundary. And that's
one of the things that he said made him want to go ahead and write that book. That's one of the strong pieces of evidence that said, I need to follow up on this. And that's when he decided that I need to locate Randall Carlson to take me across some of these flood zones in the Scablands to really get this up close. Mm-hmm. And we got to travel with him in fall of 2014.
Yeah, so there was actually two things: the evidence for the Younger Dryas impact, and the other thing was the dating of Göbekli Tepe. Right. So it was those two things that was enough to bring Graham back on board with exploration and research, and gave birth not only to Magician of the Gods, but America Before.
I just looked up pre-boreal. I was just checking it out. It's 8350 BC to 7050 BC. That's what it says. 83
BC.
Right. 83.
Yeah, so basically add a couple of thousand years to that to get BP. Right. And everybody knows, who listens to this now knows, I think, the difference between BC, which is before Common Era, and BP, which means before present.
Yeah, so it's 10,300 9,000 BP.
So then that's leading into what we talked about last episode, the climatic optimum. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Into the climatic optimum.
Right.
Which followed right on the heels of the Younger Dryas and leading into the early phases of the Holocene.
So the Balling and the Allerod are two different?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so they are.
They just mean that entire part of the Pleistocene?
Yeah, they're usually lumped together.
Okay. All right.
But they're actually two distinct stages within that Pleistocene Holocene transition. And I actually couldn't tell you why they are two distinct stages. I'm sure if we looked into it, it would be easy enough to answer. There's probably some line of demarcation there. It could be that 14,600 melting event, which coincides with Meltwater Pulse 1A, which was the first catastrophic rise event. It was John Shaw that coined the term catastrophic rise event, or CRE. A CRE is a catastrophic rise event.
Okay.
In ocean levels.
John Shaw that did the pioneering work on drumlins.
Yes, John Shaw, who did the pioneering work on drumlins, which we will definitely be exploring in much greater detail, because his work is really key to deciphering the whole thing, the transition.
So his name came
trigger.
up in the recent Nipigon impact video that we put up. So yeah, if people are keeping up with us, they've heard of him. But yeah, definitely worth going into deeper details about his research and his lifetime of being on the forefront of discovering these glacial age changes.
So yeah, he did the work on what I think of almost the definitive work on drumlins, and of course it was not accepted by mainstream, and there was a reason for that, and we're going to definitely be exploring that once we get into educating people about drumlins and how drumlins can be a very powerful diagnostic for reconstructing these events, these extraordinary events that were involved in the transition from glacial age to our present interglacial age. And yeah, so that'll be coming up, and it's going to be fascinating. And we would say that we were planning a trip to Lake Nipigon last year. It didn't work out because everybody's schedule was conflicted. We were gonna go with George Howard, who does the Cosmic Tusk website, which is one of the best websites about the Younger-Dryas. So I would definitely give that a recommendation for people who want to learn more. Go to George's website. Anyways, he had talked to John. John was actually going to join us, and I think if John hadn't passed away, which he did shortly after that, I think we would have made it work on our end, because he was clearly getting up in years, and we knew that he was probably not long for this world. But after he said he in his word, he would be delighted to join us at Lake Nipigon. Tragically, he passed away within couple of weeks after that.
Less than a month, definitely.
Yeah, less than a month
from the invitation, and we said we're going, and he said he'd be delighted to go, and yeah, then he didn't last much longer, unfortunately.
However, the year or two before, we did spend 4 days in the field with Jerome Lessman, professor of geology at Vancouver Island University, who was a graduate student under John Shaw and a co-author of this critically important paper that came out in the year 2000 called Channel Scablands Back to Brett's. Again, we'll be talking about that in great detail too. So we spent 4 days with him up in the drumlin fields of British Columbia, up on the Nechako Plateau, and explored those drumlin fields and the connection between those drumlin fields and the massive flooding that produced the Scablands. And I definitely think we're on to what has to be the next phase of understanding the great Scablands floods. Which again, that is something that, all of this is going to be the meat and material of our future podcasts over the next few months. We're going to be getting into and exploring all of this. So we have been talking about this transition between Pleistocene, Holocene, the termination of the Ice Age. And one of the things that has really stood out about this transition, of course, is the disappearance of worldwide of the great megafauna that were such an intrinsic part of the Ice Age for tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of years. And I think it would be worthwhile to take a look at some of that, to look at some of the some of that bestiary and learning more about these critters that we humans cohabitated this planet with for probably at least 90% of the time that we've been around. And it's only like the last 5 or 10% of the time that we humans have been here that the world has been without these great megafauna. So I think it would be a good thing to go ahead and show people. I've got some interesting slides here we can look at to kind of set the stage here. So I'm going to do a screen share. Okay, here we go.
All right, we see it.
Oh, great. Okay, so here we've got basically the northern hemisphere. Look at the northern hemisphere, the distribution of ice masses in the northern hemisphere. And of course, right here you see Greenland, and up here you see the floating sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. And that was about the extent of the floating sea ice at the time this particular graphic was produced back in the 1970s. And it's really not that much different right now if we look at it. You notice there are large portions of open water here, but that's not going to be our subject. But okay, so this is what basically you see the ice mass distribution in the Northern Hemisphere at present. So the next slide is going to be basically the same view, but looking at the ice masses during the late glacial maximum. And you can see that things were, there was a lot more area of the Northern Hemisphere buried under ice. Notice that the Arctic Ocean is completely choked off with ice. But some interesting things here. Notice Siberia is not glaciated. In fact, there's evidence of an open Arctic Ocean on the Siberian side during the late glacial maximum, which if true is going to be rather tricky to explain. And it is tricky to explain why this ice mass is not centered symmetrically about the North Pole. It's all lopsided to one side. You see that? So you can look over here and you can see that over this area, the ice might have been up to 2 miles thick. You know, there's a couple of different ways of modeling how much ice there was. But it would have been at least 1.5 miles, according to some calculations, and others maybe up to 2 miles thick over here, over the summit of the ice sheet. And then, so over here, we've got the Fennoscandian, as it's called, because it's buried. Basically, you'll notice that it's completely buried Scandinavia, and you'll notice here that this plain, this low plain here, is what is now the North Sea. So this is one of the areas that became a drowned with the 400-foot rise of sea level as the ice sheets were melting. So let's go to the next one. So this is a view at the end of the last ice age, and here you can see the two great ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet, which was the bigger of them, which was basically centered over Hudson Bay, although most of the models suggest that it formed initially there were two nuclei, one on the east side, one on the west side of Hudson Bay. Those began to nucleate ice massing around those two spots, and then eventually it coalesced. And so if you look here, this was one of those nucleation spots, and then the other one was over here. And then over here we have the Cordilleran ice sheet. So it's important to note that there were two distinct ice sheets. And the nature of the connection between these two has always been of interest, because it's likely that during the warm period, the Balling-Allarod warm period, these ice sheets melted back enough that it opened up a corridor right here between the two ice sheets. And this was basically serving as the main idea for how the Western Hemisphere was ultimately populated, was that you had people migrating across the Bering land bridge up here and then coming down the ice-free corridor. And here's this showing the distribution of the Fennoscandian ice sheet here. So you can see that here the outline of the British Isles is here and Scandinavia is up here. The North Sea would be this. So the North Sea was above, basically was under the ice sheet. Then when the initial melting occurred, there was a massive lake in this area. And now, of course, it's under, the English Channel is right here. And the English Channel has evidence of massive scouring. Now, I've seen some of the dates, and the dates for that scouring that I've seen, and I haven't really scrutinized them in detail, suggest that it was an earlier event that created the Scabland topography on the bottom of the English Channel. However, I'm sure that even if there were earlier events, the melting of the Fennoscandian certainly would have contributed to the erosional complex that's now on the bottom of the English Channel.
Is that what is referred to as Doggerland right there?
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so now here is a global topographical relief map with the modern day coastlines. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at a few of these images here to get an idea of what land areas were submerged with the rising sea levels. Now, this particular map, if I recall, is showing a decreased sea level of 350 feet. I think that was what they were using. Given that at the late glacial maximum was at least 400 feet more, what that means is that this is a very conservative map when you start looking at what was actually exposed during the LGM or late glacial maximum. So now we'll go from this map to a 350 foot lower sea level.
It's actually, excuse me, Randall, it's actually labeled as 110 meters. So as you're saying, that's real close to 350 feet, but it's 110 meters.
Okay.
That's 360 feet, 360.8 feet. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So we could still drop it at least another 40 feet, which would expose even more land area. And so now you'll notice here, look up here at the Bering land bridge. And you see that the land bridge is actually bigger than the modern state of Alaska. And I've got some more detailed here. So here we can see North America. You'll notice the size of the shelf here that separates North America from Asia, right? Alaska from Siberia. And then when we drop sea levels 360 feet, we get that. Wow. So that was an extremely huge landmass that was densely populated with megafauna during the last ice age, which is really interesting because in order to be densely populated with megafauna, it had to have enough vegetation there for them to eat. You know, when you had the great herbivores, there had to be enough vegetation there for them to eat.
And then, it had to be ice-free. That's wild that, like, over, you know, on what's now the continental U.S., we had ice coming down to so far south, and then over there in Alaska and Siberia, there was no ice and there was flowering plants and stuff. That's pretty strange.
That is pretty strange, isn't it?
Well, and unfortunately, it doesn't show the ice sheet there. Right. That's the reason why the sea level is so much lower. But as we ended up in the previous episode, number 10, you can see that Florida's at least double its width.
Yeah. Yeah. When you here, I'll toggle back.
Oh yeah.
You see there, no Hudson Bay. Notice the land, all these islands up here, and the connection up here, northern Canada to Greenland.
Yeah. Wow.
Pretty wild, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay. Then here is, Indochina area. And this is what was called Sundaland. And when I drop sea level 360 feet, you see what happens? Look at how much land area you're check up from here all the way down. All of this now becomes exposed. So, you know, we could certainly legitimately theorize that there might have been civilization of some kind in this area. Because for one thing, this would have been probably likely one of the more benign places on the planet to order to establish and build some kind of a culture or a civilization. But now you'll see how much of that got drowned. See, notice also this would be during these lowered sea levels is when the emigration to Australia likely took place. Now, Australia was populated at least 50,000 years ago. But what I'm saying is that it could have been an earlier glacial cycle that people first made it across. And I'm not saying they necessarily were able to walk across because they probably couldn't, but obviously sailing would have been much easier if you've only got to go 10 or 20 miles between islands, see?
Right. Yeah.
So then, and here's Northwestern Europe. And you'll see Scandinavia and the British Isles. Now we're going to drop sea level 360 feet.
There was a Randall. I think I gave the copy of National Geographic to you that talked about archaeologists were surprised to find that fish trawlers were bringing up artifacts from that area where the North Sea is now. It completely surprised the archaeologists, and according to this article, that wow, there were people there. Imagine that.
Yeah, well, over and over and over again. How many decades have I been saying, that we're really a lot of the important and critical archaeological finds in the next few decades are going to be marine archaeology. Yeah. Because literally during the ice ages, when sea levels were lowered, being on the coastlines is most likely the most benevolent place to put down roots.
It's still where the majority of the human population lives now, is along seacoasts and waterways.
Yes, exactly. And when you realize that sea level rise was not really a smooth process, but there were these interruptions, the CREs that I mentioned earlier, the catastrophic rise events. It means people would have had to uproot and move inland quite quickly. So, yeah, this gives folks an idea of the how vast these changes were. So, I guess I will stop share there.
So the total cumulative amount of ice that was packed in over North America, and including that Fennoscandian, is estimated at 6 to 7 million cubic miles.
Yeah.
Right, which is fairly, close equivalent to what's covering Antarctica today.
Yep.
So, that's the kind of amount of ice that's got to melt to raise sea level, nearly 400 feet. Like you explained before, you look a mile that way and a mile that way and then a mile up. Okay, you got a mile of cubic ice, and then multiply that by 6 million. It's just, it's hard to comprehend that's what was on the landscape and is now in the ocean.
Yeah.
And what happens to create that change? Somehow that much ice has got to transform into water and then get in the ocean basins. And there's no normal process on the earth that we typically see in modern history that's going to explain that. So there's got to be some, as you again spoke recently about the outrageous hypotheses. You got to think outrageously sometimes about these processes on the earth that transpire to create these sudden changes.
Yeah.
If you live in Canada, go outside, go a mile straight up, and you're still not on top of the ice yet. Basically, is what he's saying.
I've done that. I've laid on some gravel piles there in central Canada and thought, well, yeah, I'm still buried by a mile of ice here. Right. Everything that you see in Canada was buried. Everything across Canada was buried. It's just it's a wild thought exercise to go through, and the people that live there are just could be in constant amazement of what shape what's outside their front door.
And, right. It is sort of a insight into what nature can do, the kinds of changes that nature can affect. Let's take it to the human perspective and say, okay, let's say that the government of Canada decides that they're going to pull out all the stops and they're going to lease all the forest lands of Canada to the big timber companies. And the timber companies are going to come in and they are going to clear cut from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the 49th parallel up to the tundra, and they're going to cut every single tree, completely flatten it, right? We would think, oh my God, this is horrible. This is terrible to do such a thing like this. This is an obscenity. It's an abomination. Yet nature did that. Nature pretty much completely wiped out the forests that were in Canada, buried them under ice, and when the ice melted, of course, then the forest started coming back again. But literally,
the melt wiped out all the forest down below that, and
right.
yeah. I mean, the onset of the Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheets pretty much clear cut the whole of Canada. See,
right, yeah. And then when they melted, it clear cut a bunch of stuff southward of that. That's what
yes,
he was
it did.
Yeah,
yes,
it did.
Yeah. So, the indigenous peoples of North America had many tales about life during those times, especially tales with respect to the great megafauna. And I've got a collection of those together that we'll address because they're pretty fascinating in their own right. Pawnee. There was a Pawnee hero stories and folktales who talked about this. In the beginning, before making people, Tirawa, the creator, decided to create giant creatures to live in this world. Tirawa made them in many shapes, but in several ways they were all alike. They were very big and very strong. And lots of traditions have preserved memories of the great megafauna that went extinct at the end of the last ice age. And what's interesting about that is because within the context of all this new knowledge that's coming out, we have this boundary between the Bowling Alrod and the Younger-Dryas, which is dated to just under 12,900 years. And below that boundary, we find megafaunal remains and not above. And below that boundary, we find the evidence of North American habitation on the part of the Clovis people, who then disappear right at that boundary. So in terms of the animal life, that's something I'd like to kind of dwell on a little bit, because it's so fascinating and so interesting to, to contemplate this bestiary, this ice age bestiary that occupied North America, because most people are not really aware or cognizant of how the extent of this population of great animals. So we'll get into that a little bit here. Going back through, one of my early textbooks was The Earth Through Time by Harold L. Levin, geologist, which was from 1982. And he was referring to the Pleistocene and its occupants. And he said that the Pleistocene was a time of splendid diversity among mammals. The fauna was probably more varied and impressive than that of Africa a century ago. The Pleistocene was an age of giants in which colossal ground sloths, beavers over 2 meters tall, giant dire wolves, bison and tall rangy mammoths, and woolly rhinoceroses ranged far and wide across the continents. Earlier, way back in 1836, when Charles Darwin was exploring the American continent, this is what he said: "It is impossible to reflect on the state of the American continent without astonishment. Formerly, it must have swarmed with great monsters. Now we find mere pygmies compared with the antecedent allied races." And I think we'll do a few images here to help stimulate an appreciation of the nature of some of these beasts. Here we have a really interesting graphic. So on the left, we have a modern elephant jaw, and on the right, we have a mastodon jaw. So these mastodon remains were being found all over non-glaciated North America, particularly on the east side, in the Mississippi Valley and in the southeast. Mastodons were quite prolific. Bradley and I visited the so-called Big Bone Lick on the border of Kentucky and Ohio, maybe a decade ago, 15 years ago?
Closer to 15 now, yeah, man.
Yeah, years go by so quick, I lose track. But this was a mastodon, a mass death site of mastodons. And it goes back in history because it was discovered by early explorers. And in fact, a number of the specimens that were found there along this swampy creek side were sent to Thomas Jefferson, who had a collection in one of the rooms in the White House of these great extinct animals. When they first found these bones, they didn't know what they were looking at. When they looked at this jaw, they found these teeth here. Now, mastodons are browsers, which means that they're eating tree branches. So they have really big, powerful jaws, and their molars are, as you see here. Well, when they found these jaws, of course, what they're thinking is that, my God, we found the jawbone of a monster. And it was assumed that it was probably a carnivorous beast, just because of the nature of the molars in there. But you can see it. Compare the molars of the mastodon over here to the molars of the modern elephant. And you can see how they might have been pretty nervous about.
Yeah, those are.
Is this the and see when Lewis and Clark went out on their expedition, Thomas Jefferson sent a secret message to Clark, I believe it was. I don't remember which one. Saying that if you encountered, and since they didn't know what it was, they called it the American Incognitum. If you find one living in the Western wilderness, try to capture it and bring it back.
Yeah, sure.
Because I think Jefferson was thinking it would be a nice addition to the grounds there at the White House to have a mastodon grazing. No, they literally didn't know if it was a carnivore or an herbivore. They didn't know. Of course, and it's an herbivore. It's like all proboscideans and elephants. It eats plant matter. But yeah, this is.
I was just going to say he had quite a fossil collection already, so he was definitely interested and knew about the stories of these great skeletons that have been found and
Yes.
bone finds. So he's like, yeah, bring that back to me.
Yeah, and I wish that we had a president today that had a collection of extinct animal bones in the White House.
That'd be great.
And if I ever am elected president, I promise that I will dedicate one room of the White House to
Randall Carlson.
to extinct megafaunal remains. Okay, so there we have the great American Incognitum, a mastodon skeleton unearthed by Charles Wilson Peale in 1801 in the Hudson Valley.
Still looks like a monster.
Yeah, now imagine that and look at the skull. See, when you find the skulls of these extinct proboscideans, this was one of the things that led to legends of Cyclops, that there was a single big eye right in the forehead.
Sure.
Now, can you imagine you're hiking merrily along, along the trail, and you're up in, this is just going to be north of New York City. You're hiking along, and all of a sudden you come around the bend, and you come face to face with this guy.
Yeah.
Our ancestors did. That's the point. Our ancestor did.
Run away, run away.
How do you know that's not actually a Cyclops skull stuck on that elephant skeleton?
Well, I mean,
Somebody messed that up.
all right. And here's another one.
And
So
that was probably
Let's see.
14 feet high, 12, 14, does it say? Yeah.
The guy sweeping back there.
Yeah. Well,
Crazy
mastodons are, well, never mind. So here's a skeleton, and just for the sake of scale, I put an old picture in there at the appropriate scale.
All right.
Circa 1998.
Yeah, that was about 1998. Okay.
Is that the same skeleton as the previous picture?
No, this is a different. This is the Warren mastodon. It was found. Where was he found? In Ohio, I think. And here's kind of a reconstruction of what one of them would have looked like. This is a mastodon found in New York State. Obviously, this, like I said, this is a reconstruction. But, actually, he looks a lot. All I'd have to do is add a couple of tusks to one of my dogs, and he'd look like that. But, yeah, there you go. So think about that. This guy was very prevalent in North America during the Ice Age. And here's another Mammoth americanum, the American mastodon, existed from about 5 million years before present to about 12,000. And the painting here, one of my favorite books, and I think it's still available. I'll pull it out here with Art Zdeněk Burian, who is one of my favorite artists of extinct animals. I'll show the book after a minute here when we stop the screen share. But we'll keep going. Let's see. I put a figure in here so you can kind of get a sense of the scale here.
Oh, yeah.
Lunch.
Lunch.
All right. Let's keep going here. Yes, Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, existed from approximately 2 million years before present. I'm putting down 12,000 years before present only because I made this probably 15 years ago I put this together, or even longer than that. And so at that time, the younger onset of the Younger-Dryas had not been precisely dated to 12,000, slightly less than 12,900. But it's very possible that the extinction did come through several waves. But again, most of the evidence seems to suggest that Younger-Dryas boundary marks the cap where most of the megafaunal species that disappeared did so at that point. This is Charles R. Knight, who did paintings for the American Museum of Natural History, and he is one of the considered great artists of extinct animals, including dinosaurs. And he did several books. I had a book illustrated by him as a kid that really served to stimulate an interest in all of this kind of stuff. So yeah, Charles R. Knight, and I'm sure anybody, if you could look him up online, you'll find out a lot of information about him, and hopefully some high-res reproductions of some of his paintings. So this was the Homotherium, which was a sort of a cheetah-like animal that went extinct. The Megaloceros, the giant Irish elk, and notice the dire wolves. So this guy here, let's see, I think I put Brad in there for scale. Yes.
Wow.
Ugh.
You can see how impressive that beast. And you can see from this, you probably would not want to have a pack of dire wolves on your tail.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, it's been a number of paleontologists that I've read, I can't think of off the top of my head who, because this was many years ago, were speculating that one reason, for example, that the American mountain lion is scared of dogs might be some kind of genetic memory of dire wolves. Yeah. Because, yeah, even a little 40-pound mutt can tree a mountain lion. And you're going, wait a second, come on.
But if I would have gotten the video, it would have been worth it.
It would have been. It would have been.
I don't know. That would have been worth it.
For
I'm
posterity.
wondering if there's a connection between dire wolves and legends about dire wolves and werewolves. Lycanthropy.
Lycanthropy.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that, but
There is, well, yeah, probably won't go into that. Interesting. There are just interesting wolf legends of not werewolves, but giant dark dogs as well. In Europe.
yeah, devil dogs and things. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, look at these guys.
Right. That would be terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be terrifying to have what was the movie that came out with Liam Neeson here a year or two ago where they were crash?
The Gray.
The Gray, right. Anybody see that?
Yeah, that was a
Tense.
tense
Yeah,
movie. Yes, very tense movie. I mean, you wind up putting yourself in the shoes of these characters who are these guys who survive a plane wreck and then are chased across the frozen north by
Alaska. I think they're in Alaska probably.
Yeah, they're chased across the tundra and then through the woods by a pack of wolves that are essentially herding these guys, and they don't realize it. The wolves are herding them.
Yep.
Okay.
Cool.
This is Panthera atrox, the American Pleistocene lion, and you'll notice he's just killed a horse, and the lion is as big as the horse.
Good.
Yeah, let's see, who have I got here? Okay, so there's a human to scale.
Man. Yeah, but well.
So you start to understand why an island out in the middle of the Atlantic would be a good place to set
Right.
up your society.
There aren't horse-sized giant cats.
Yeah.
That would like to eat you for lunch.
That's right.
See, as we go through this, you begin to realize that, humans during the late Pleistocene, when they got up in the morning, their priorities were a lot different than many of us today, who's wake up in the morning and our most important goal for the day is to not be eaten.
Yeah.
That would be a whole different mindset. Mammothus trogontherii. This was, I think this was the largest of the mammoths. Yeah, there we go. I put a little figure in here. You can see how big these guys were.
God.
They were huge. Up to 16 feet tall at the shoulder.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It is. And just some various art that I found. I don't know who painted this. Oh, yes. And then here, this was at Hot Springs, South Dakota. This was the Mammothus Imperator, the Imperial mammoth, which was another really big mammoth. And that's Graham Hancock there next to. So this was basically a life-size mock-up of Mammothus Imperator.
Wow.
So we've seen 4 species, then there's woolly mammoths. So you've got 4 different species of mammoths, or proboscideans. Proboscideans means the long proboscis, right? Four species of proboscideans in North America. How many of you got in Africa today? 1. How many of you got in India? 1. So you got two distinct species of proboscideans alive today. Yet there was 4 in North America during the Ice Age. Now here's
0 today.
Yeah, versus 0 today. So here's your diagram of a grizzly bear skull. And I can imagine you wouldn't want a grizzly bear, a mad grizzly bear after you.
Oh, so it's pretty big.
But the cave bear is this guy.
Oh, man.
Ursus spalaeus, the giant cave bear. So you can see when Darwin is talking about North America swarming with these giant monsters, because I mean they're finding this stuff, you see, and they're going and they're attempting to understand this.
Short-faced cave bear, is that what that is?
No, that's Arctodus simus. This is Ursus spalaeus, which is the giant Ursus spalaeus, as in caves. Ursus bear, so it's the giant cave bear. And there's a way you can distinguish between Ursus spalaeus and Arctodus simus. I'll show you a slide in a minute, which is the easiest way to differentiate between the 2 different bear species. So here's the comparison of the modern grizzly skeleton with that of Ursus spalaeus, the giant cave bear. So so then here's Charles. Okay, so here's Ursus spalaeus, giant cave bear. Also became extinct, at that same Younger-Dryas boundary. And I'll put, there's Brad in there for scale. You got to hand it to Brad. That guy has a lot of nerve.
Yeah.
And so here's Charles R. Knight's version of the giant cave bear. I'll show you I'll show you an image here of Arctodus simus, which is the giant short-faced bear, in a second. Generally, the way you can easily and quickly, even the layman can quickly distinguish between Ursus spalaeus and Arctodus simus is the cave bear usually is seen carrying a club. And that's usually the simplest way. And oftentimes the hat is a giveaway.
Rare bear.
Okay, so here's Mammoth primigenius, the woolly mammoth, sort of icon of the Ice Age, went extinct at the Pleistocene Holocene boundary. And again, this is Z and X artwork here. And again, Mammothus Imperator. This was the really big one, 16 foot tall at the shoulder. And here's when we were up hiking one day, we came across this femur of a mammoth. What? It
was just standing there,
sticking out of the ground like that.
Well, no, Brad had just set it up on end and had carefully balanced it just for the picture. Yeah. No, but this is actual to scale. So this is the thigh bone of a mammoth to scale.
Wow.
I better see. I'm not sure what's ahead of here. I better take a look. Okay, so. Okay. All right. Elasmotherium Sibericum. This was the one of the giant woolly rhinos of Siberia. And let's see who put my brother Rowan in there for scale. Now that would be a pretty impressive beast, you got to admit.
Yep.
And then Coelodonta, the woolly rhinoceros. This was a North American animal. You found them quite prevalent up in non-glaciated Yukon and Alaska. I don't think they were found down in the southern part of the U.S. And Smilodon stalking a Shasta ground sloth. So that was one of the at least 4 species of ground sloth. The bison latifrons, or the super bison, and put a person in there for scale. Their horns could actually reach up to 10 or 12 feet for the really big ones for a span.
Man.
So this particular beast was like double the size or mass of the modern American bison. And I don't know how many of you have ever encountered close up modern American bison, but they're a pretty impressive animal.
Yeah. We have a bunch of them around us. Yeah.
Yeah. So you know what I'm talking about.
I'd like to make me a drinking horn out of one of those.
Hey, yeah. Well, listen, man, I want a helmet with bison latifrons.
Yeah.
Right.
A 10-foot. That's
Listen, if
horn helmet.
if anybody out there listening has horns from a bison latifron, hey, it'd be really cool. I would wear it. I would get a helmet and I would wear it for the podcast.
I'm gonna have to get a bigger PO box.
You're gonna need a bigger office.
Okay. And here's Castorides, the giant beaver. Was particularly prevalent in the southeast, but I think he was over there where you guys live too. So this was your 500-pound, 600-pound beaver.
Wow.
Don't even touch that.
Yeah.
Procoptodon, this was an Australian animal. The giant kangaroo.
What?
So, here we go. Let's not pass this up. Yeah. Arctodus simus, the giant short-faced bear. Now, you notice the long legs on this
Limbs.
brute.
Yeah.
The legs.
You would not want
Speedy.
this guy after you.
Uh-uh.
Your chances of survival would be pretty slim.
Right.
Yeah. So this was considered the apex predator of the
That
United
guy
States.
can probably move pretty fast. I mean,
Yeah,
he looks like a dog.
he looks like
Yeah.
part dog, part cat, part bear.
Yeah.
That's
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this just gives you a sense of the incredible bestiary that this planet hosted up until 12 or 13,000 years ago, and that rapidly, in the geological eye blink, disappeared. But what has the dominant theory been up until recent years? Well, human overhunting.
Sure.
Brad had a spear and not a camera, and he took those guys out.
So, we're going to talk about that, but think about it. Okay, it's one thing to say they hunted the woolly mammoths to extinction, but wait a second. They hunted all 4 species of big old proboscideans to extinction, plus all these other animals that we were just seeing. How do you explain that?
Plus all the
Well-
horses. And, yeah.
Well, as I've pointed out, the flaw in that theory is, you've got roving bands of hunter-gatherers, 100 to 150 people in a band, maximum, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to, and how many bands are there? Where's the evidence for all these roving bands? Where's the evidence for the millions of people it would have taken to kill all these animals? There isn't any.
Right.
No,
We can't
no.
find any Clovis people.
Right. We can find artifacts, but no people.
Right.
Which brings us to another interesting
Anzac
subject
one.
that we have to come back to.
So I was going to ask, too, do you think, were there large people? There were all these large animals. What was the flora like? Was it all large? Were the trees massive?
I don't know if the trees were, if the flora was necessarily. I haven't studied into that to the extent that I have the fauna.
Let's discuss that. For all these megafauna to exist, what was the environment like for them, and what was the competition for animals to get that large? It means they've got to have a successful diet,
Mm-hmm.
and that means lots of smaller game to feed on, which would have had to have been abundant for them to reach that size. It raises a host of other questions.
An enormous biomass to support that many gigantic herbivores.
Yes.
And yet we're in the midst of an ice age.
Yeah.
Right.
That was the other question I had. How come when you were showing those maps of the globe where all of this land was connecting into Asia and everything, why didn't they go over there? If people could come across that bridge, how come the animals didn't go across the bridge the other way? And why aren't they found all over there? Why are they just
Well,
here?
no, they are found over there. In fact, some of the densest remains of mammoths are found washing up on the shores of the Arctic Ocean by Siberia. We're going to get into that.
I knew that about Siberia, but what about all these the megafauna? Were they also over there too?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for example, mammoths ranged from, unglaciated North America, both below, south of the ice sheet, and then up in the Yukon area and Alaska and the Bering land bridge, all the way across Europe and Asia, all the way across to the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, I mean, they found mammoth remains have been found in England.
Yeah, so this not only wiped them out. We always talk about it in terms of like, well, it wiped them out in North America, but it
wiped out in Europe, all over the world.
Yeah,
all over the world. Now the question is, was it a simultaneous extinction all over the world? Maybe not, but the evidence that I've been looking at suggests that it probably was. And, we're looking at events here that once we get into exploring more specifically the nature of these events that occurred, it's likely that we're looking at a series of events. And within this series of events, there may have been a couple of spikes of enormous, extreme power, and then lesser of it. Just like if you have an earthquake, you may have precursor earthquakes leading up to the grand one. Just like when we look at major volcanic eruptions, like Mount St. Helens didn't just completely all of a sudden blow its stack. Krakatoa didn't just immediately all of a sudden. It pretty much gave months of forewarning. It started rumbling. It started degassing. It started becoming active prior to the major eruption. And then after the major eruption, you find a sort of a diminishing crescendo of aftershock type events, just like earthquakes will have aftershocks. And I think that's how we need to look at this. A lot of the critics are saying, well, we can look at the animal extinction and we see that it all didn't happen all at once, right? So therefore we can rule out impact type events. But I don't think that's really what the case here at all. I think that, yeah, we can certainly look at a protracted extinction event, maybe taking 1,000 years, without abandoning the idea of a global catastrophe or speculating as to what the trigger of that global catastrophe would have been.
Yeah, I mean, they don't think that that impact that happened killed all the the Jurassic period, or they don't think that the KT boundary happened in one night, right? That the impact did, but it took a long time.
It may have taken. Actually, though, in terms of the KT, it may have been really short.
Right, but still not that day, basically.
Not necessarily that day, but probably within a decade or less, because the consequences of that KT boundary were definitely global. And we're talking here about the 66 million year ago dinosaur extinction,
right?
Which in a way has many interesting parallels with the Pleistocene Holocene extinction. And all of this is going to be the stuff that we explore as we begin to dissect these events and look at them under a much more detailed microscope.
So what are the hypotheses in the middle, or maybe that's what you're saying we're going to get to eventually? If you got a huge catastrophe that knocks them out suddenly from nature, and on the other end you got human hunters that wipe out millions and millions of these huge animals, what's in the middle? Some sort of disease,
disease has been speculated.
There's just one or two other ideas out there, really.
Yeah, pretty much. And as far as humans, what I would do is I would give to humans a role, but only in the latter phases. In other words, nature has wiped out the majority of these beasts, and there could be pockets of survivors that in that context could possibly be hunted to extinction.
Yeah.
And I think we should be open to that. I mean, that is a possibility. I don't completely rule out a human role in this. However, I think the human role has been vastly overstated.
Well,
go ahead, Mike.
Well, to digress again, picking up on Snake Bro's comment, was it Kyle or was it Ross? Where are the remains of the Clovis people? We find remains of these
Where are the Clovis?
Yeah, where we find the remains of these megafauna, but where are the remains of these Clovis people?
That's a question I've been contemplating for years now.
There are probably a lot more megafauna than there were Clovis people, for one thing.
That certainly could be. And then, and if that's the case, then of course that completely mitigates against the humans.
Human.
You know, I've seen estimates now of the human population of 5 to 10 million during the late Ice Age.
And there were,
there was estimated. I've seen estimates 10 to 12 million proboscideans, right? So, I mean, how is it even possible? I mean, even if you had a 1-to-1 ratio, I mean, you're not going to be able to kill those beasts so fast that there's not going to be any, you might have a small area where you could wipe out. Yeah, you take maybe 10 square miles, 100 square miles, and you just kill off every mammoth there. But
they certainly wouldn't be eating all the meat.
No.
Right. So what would be their incentive to just kill them all? Just kill them all.
Yeah. Right. It doesn't make sense.
No,
Yeah, especially with the cats. I mean, they're hard to find.
Right.
They're really good at not being seen.
Yeah,
Sure.
the giant.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about these ones that are extinct. Obviously, we don't know anything about them. But
Judging
we have
on the nature of cats. Sorry.
Yeah, we have mountain lions around here. Never see them.
Yeah.
Very, very rarely. And they make, they have these rounds that are huge, miles and miles. They'll travel.
Yeah.
These circuits or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they can be hunted and trapped and stuff, but it's not easy.
Right.
Well, that raises the question, if the megafauna did vastly outnumber the humans, and I find the 5 to 10 million number just kind of specious. It's, where's the evidence for 5 to 10 million people? It's.
Well, we can certainly come back to that because I've got some interesting papers that have been written estimates of.
Did the megafauna wind up eating all the Clovis people?
I don't think so, Mike.
Okay.
Somewhere off the continental shelf, there's a really big canoe with lots of remains.
Okay, Megatherium americanum is the giant ground sloth, and let's put Brad in here so you can get an idea how big this guy was.
Well, he liked his belly being scratched. I tell you what, he liked that.
So these guys were basically the size of modern elephants. And just one more of the incredible megafauna. The glyptodonts, which were South American, giant armadillo-like creatures.
Wow.
So we haven't even hardly touched upon the South American megafauna, but they were as prolific as the North American, and they also went extinct.
Now, if those guys are anything like our modern armadillos, then you can totally walk up to those guys and spook them. They won't even know you're there.
Right.
They got their head down in the ground.
They're blind and deaf.
Yeah, you just walk right up to them, grab them by the tail.
With a big spiky tail.
Yeah, go for a ride.
Yeah.
So this is the book. I had this one when I was younger, much younger. Loved the color paintings in there by Zdeněk Burian. So this is the book, Life Before Man. And as you can see in here, it's got a lot of great paintings by this artist. Yeah, I love this book.
First time I ever saw Randall present, it was a time of Hail Bop, and he was supposed to be talking about comets and impacts, and he spent probably 45 minutes going into all these animals, and I'd never met him before. Well, I did briefly, but I was so frustrated that he took all this time on these animals. And he's so fascinated with these animals, and he had a big fascination with dinosaurs beforehand. But I've totally gotten interested also since then. But that first time I was so frustrated because he really got into these animals. But it's a whole amazing bestiary, like he says, that just disappeared. That were everywhere out our front doors. Like we're talking in Canada, was ice for a mile thick. But if you were in the United States, you look out your front door if you had a door at the time, right? you got these huge animals, so
Yeah.
totally different than the ice. But and again, it's all gone. Where did they go?
Yeah.
What happened to them? It's a fascinating mystery, and I understand totally now why he was so enthralled with them and spent so much time introducing them to us at that time. That was 1997.
But you wanted him to talk about comets, not.
Well, at the time, yeah, I did, but.
So now it comes out.
I was grasshopper, I guess I'm still grasshopper.
Okay.
Well, we're
the
past,
giant Pleistocene grasshopper.
That's right.
Got a hell of a whistle.
We're just past an hour here, Randall. So just giving you a heads up.
What's happening?
We've passed an hour on the.
Oh, I thought you said you were passing out.
Oh yeah, but that's also happening. But
okay. Well, okay. So and it was me who said we should cut it off at an hour for all of those who've been blaming you guys. I will take full credit for that. Don't blame these guys. Look, look, if it wasn't for those guys, we wouldn't have this podcast going on right now. Okay. I want you to get that, right? Because they're handling the technology here. And all I have to do is sit down and shoot my big mouth off and show some.
Bravo, Snake Bros.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
So I don't want to hear any more complaining about the shiny boys.
Or the laughing boys.
Let
them laugh all they want.
Beavis and Butthead reincarnated.
Is that what somebody said?
Oh, you're getting all angles, man.
Okay, so we'll go on a few more minutes. What the hell, okay?
Yeah, a few more at least.
Back to the book that I quoted from earlier by Harold L. Levin, professor of geology at Washington University. In that book, he said, at the time of maximum continental glaciation, the northern hemisphere supported an abundant and varied fauna of large mammals, comparable to that which existed in Africa south of the Sahara several decades ago. The fauna included giant beavers, mammoths, mastodons, elks, most species of perissodactyls, which are hoofed animals, many even toad forms, and ground sloths. From all available evidence, most of these great beasts maintained their numbers quite well during the most severe episodes of glaciation, but experienced rapid decline and extinction in the period when the climate became milder. What might have been the cause for the extermination of these large Pleistocene mammals? Now, this is a book that came out in 82. So at this point, they were only beginning to realize the nature of the Younger-Dryas, right? If you look at it from a slightly larger perspective, right, if all these animals are going extinct around 12,000 to 13,000 years ago, it isn't during the time when, the Ice Age is ameliorating and we're getting into the much warmer Holocene. So how come when the climate is actually becoming more benign, are all these animals becoming extinct? Well, since 1982, we have a much better grasp of the Younger-Dryas and this 1,300-year cold snap that engulfed the planet at 12,900 years ago. So we now realize that the extinction seems to be associated with these massive shifts in climate, which was not really understood back then. So going back to one more quote from Harold Levin, again, this is the book, The Earth Through Time. One might think an assemblage of beasts that had proved their stamina against the difficulties of an ice age would persist for at least as long as did the dinosaurs. Yet, widespread extermination and extinction was the dominant biological theme at the end of the Pleistocene. The cause of the extinctions is unknown. And going way back to 1802 now, let's back up a little bit. 1802, Rembrandt Peale, who is considered to be America's first naturalist scientist, right? Look him up. He's an interesting man, did some interesting work. He was involved in a number of excavations of extinct megafauna. Back in 1802, he wrote this: How long, since these animals have existed, we shall perhaps ever remain in ignorance? Well, we now, of course, know when they existed, a couple of hundred years later, but in 1802, they had no means of dating. All they knew was they were finding the remains of these animals when they were excavating, when farmers were plowing a field to put in crops, and they would dig these things up. If they're digging a canal, they would find these things, sometimes just laying right on the ground, like in the case of the Big Bone Lick on the Kentucky-Ohio border. You had huge numbers of mastodon skeletal remains sticking up out of the swampy ground. So, can you imagine the early explorers walking into this elephant graveyard, and here are these 8, 9, 10-foot rib cages sticking up out of the ground? That would be a pretty impressive find.
That would be amazing.
So then Rembrandt Peale goes on to say, certain we are that they existed in great abundance from the number of their remains which are found in America. We are likewise sure that they must have been destroyed by some sudden and powerful cause. Now, his speculations there, I think, are much more realistic than the 20th century speculations that they were hunted. I mean, the overkill hypothesis is the name usually given to the human predation, the idea that humans hunted the megafauna to extinction. Now, you could say, well, yes, they were a sudden and powerful cause, but I think when we look at all the evidence, I think we can pretty much throw that idea out, that humans were basically, struggling for their survival in the late Pleistocene world, not only against a harsh climate, but against a bestiary that would be more than happy to eat humans to extinction if they could.
Also,
go ahead.
Like the majority of the bones that they find, they're fossilized, aren't they? Or are they actually the younger ones, like from, say?
Yeah. I mean, they're actual bones, and tusks with the ivories, that are still. In fact, a lot of the mammoth, a lot of the ivory sold on the international ivory market during the 19th century and early 20th century was woolly mammoth.
Mine, yeah.
So I mean, when you look at a lot of the fossils from much older animals, you're looking at the collagen in the biologic material has been replaced in a lot of cases by minerals. But in the case of the Pleistocene megafauna, no, we're looking at actual bones.
Okay.
Yeah, mammoth tusk and ivory are real popular for guitar nuts and saddles.
Yeah.
You're kidding me.
No.
That's where the bone nuts are ivory? I've never.
That's not all of them. I mean, but you can buy mammoth tusk saddles and nuts.
I didn't know that.
I'm going to do that.
Can? I mean, I know there's been a ban on the trading of ivory.
Oh, elephant ivory.
Yeah,
but not fossilized ivory.
Not ancient ivory.
Well, I mean, the thing is that some of the mammoth ivory is almost indistinguishable. I think that's included. I mean, I think the ban is on all ivory. Maybe if somebody listening knows, I haven't really.
Well, I'm not necessarily talking about ivory. When I say ivory, I mean generally speaking, we're talking about bone as well.
No,
bone
okay.
Nuts. Bone nuts.
Yeah, bone. Okay.
Yep.
So, in regards to the question about what happened to the Clovis, while not shedding any light on that mystery, Rembrandt Peale goes on in his comments to sort of address that when he says this: is that it is extremely probable that whenever and by whatever means the extirpation of this tremendous race of animals was effected, the same cause must have operated in the destruction of all those inhabitants from whom we might have received some satisfactory account of them.
Yeah.
And then in 1876, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was one of the co-developers of the ideas of evolution, along with, if you look up the origins of evolutionary theory, you will see that alongside of Charles Darwin is Alfred Russel Wallace. And he wrote a book that was published in 1876 entitled The Geographical Distribution of Animals. And this was in volume 1 of a multi-volume set. And this is what he said. And I think, again, he's looking for something that to me is almost more realistic than some of the ideas and theories that came along in the 20th century. Quote, "We live in a zoologically impoverished world, from which all the hugest and fiercest and strangest forms have recently disappeared. Yet it is surely a marvelous fact, and one that has hardly been sufficiently dwelt upon, this sudden dying out of so many large mammalia, not in one place only, but over half the land surface of the globe. There must have been some physical cause for this great change, and it must have been a cause capable of acting almost simultaneously over large portions of the Earth's surface." Mm-hmm. And then William Buckland, one of the godfathers of modern geology, along with Cuvier and Agassiz and about a half a dozen other prominent early scientists and naturalists. He was looking at the remains and the context, the geological context in which the late Pleistocene megafaunal remains were being found. What did he find? He found that they were mostly found in gravel pits, in loam, in peat bogs, and so on. Now, how do you get an extensive, large deposit of gravel?
Water.
Flood.
Water. Exactly. That's right. Now, William Buckland said this in 1823. "How is it possible to explain the general dispersion of all these remains, but by admitting that the elephants, as well as all the other creatures whose bones are buried with them, were the antediluvian inhabitants of the extensive tracts of country over which we have been tracing them, and that they were all destroyed together by the waters of the same inundation which produced the deposits of loam and gravel in which they are now embedded." Yeah. See, I think a lot of these older guys back then
They got it.
I think we'll end with one more quote from Charles Darwin, and then we'll pick it up in our next episode. This was in his 1871 in his Journal of Researches into the Natural History and Geology of the countries visited during the voyage of HMS Beagle round the world under the command of Captain Fitzroy, Royal Navy. All right, this is what he said. "What then has exterminated so many species and whole genera? The mind is at first irresistibly hurried into belief of some great catastrophe. But thus to destroy animals, both large and small, in southern Patagonia, in Brazil, on the Cordillera of Peru, in North America up to Bering Straits, we must shake up the entire framework of the globe." In the end, he couldn't accept that. That was just too much for him because he couldn't imagine, how do you shake up the whole framework of the globe? So it's an interesting conundrum, and we're going to pick up the thread of these ideas, and we're going to talk about the Clovis. We're going to talk about the great climate changes and possibly the trigger. What was that sudden and powerful impulse that Rembrandt Peale was invoking to try to explain this? What is it that could shake the framework of the globe? What power could do that? So these are going to be some of the questions that we explore further. So stick with us, folks.
Superb.
And help us out. Help us put this thing up to the next level.
I also wanted to point out on the overhunting thing, it seems a bit outdated to me now because you've probably read more. I'm sure you read more papers on this than I have. I've read a few, and I read a bunch of articles about it. But they're always trying to point out that like that the arrival of humans on the scene in North America coincides very closely with the death of all these animals, and that's how they're trying to make the correlation. But now that's a Clovis first idea.
Yeah.
Now
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's
That's a very good point, Russ. I mean, because if we accept this idea that there was these hordes of hunters that swept across the Bering land bridge down through the ice-free corridor, slaughtering every animal in their pathway, right? And because these animals were so naive when it came to humans that they just stood there like like Dumbo and got speared to death. Well, obviously, your point is that if this new evidence is emerging that Clovis was later, that there were earlier,
that there are people
15, 20,000 years ago, or older, well, then that idea pretty much collapses.
Right. Their main correlation of like arrival of humans and these animals all die falls apart. And after that, there's almost no evidence for overhunting. So that was my point.
Yes, and it's a good point.
Thank you.
Russ, you get an attaboy for that.
All right, sweet.
Good job, bro.
All right. Well, on that note, we should end the show since I just did something totally awesome.
Congratulations.
Timely.
Yeah. All right, everybody can get a hold of us. Kosmographia with a K, Kosmographia1618@gmail.com. Send us emails. I know we've gotten a bunch that are in the backlog. We're going to start looking at those. By the time you hear this, we will have looked at all of them. So you can also support the show. We have a Patreon page, patreon.com/Randall Carlson. All that money goes directly into Randall's wallet, straight into it. So the more support we have there, the fatter his wallet gets and the more chance we will have to
learn more.
That's right.
Yes. Well, with that money, I will be able to fund the lifestyle to which I aspire.
And there are quite a few new Patreons, so much appreciated. And there are perks that come along with that, and more in the development. But
we've got some good ideas for juicy little perks.
Absolutely,
it's going to be coming up. Yeah.
Cool.
The
Website.
simplest one is early access to some of the videos of the podcast as they come out. But yeah, there's more deeper level things coming through that you'll be loving.
Good deal. When are you guys going to tell us about this?
Well, we'll get around to it.
Okay. Were you going to say something?
No.
Okay.
No.
Kosmographia.com for the website. Once again, Kosmographia with a K, and that is basically a blog. It's the hub for all of the podcast stuff. So that's about it. You guys get a hold of us. Email. Also, definitely check out the YouTube. Everyone should write comments on the YouTube and just really like flame Brad. That's what you should do on YouTube.
Overwhelm him.
Just completely overwhelm him so that he stops trying to curate them.
Just don't curse, because all the cursings go into an automatic folder that segments them off.
Deleted.
Keep it clean, folks.
But now you can also comment on any of the shows on the blog, on the website, Kosmographia.com. So if you want to write more longer, more involved, but still public comments, that's a good place to do it as well. So.
Oh yeah.
I've got a teenage niece, so don't send anything that would be unacceptable for my teenage niece to read.
Good point. All right, I think that's it, gentlemen.
Good night.
Thank you.
Great podcast as always. Have a good night.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Awesome, Randall. See ya.
This is Kosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.